On the night of October 15th, 1952, inside the Montreal Forum, a towering wrestler scaled the top turnbuckle, leapt into the air, and drove his knee down toward a fallen opponent. He had thrown that move 1,000 times. But this time, the man on the canvas shifted at the last instant. The wrestler's shin grazed the side of his opponent's head, and a piece of the man's ear tore clean away and dropped to the mat. It was an accident, a pure freakish accident. The opponent's ears had already been pulped and cauliflowered by years of punishment, and the contact missed being nothing at all by a fraction of an inch. But the man who threw that knee would spend the next 50 years as the most feared monster in his entire profession because of it. He would become Killer Kowalski, a name whispered in horror by millions. The figure parents helped up to children as the very face of evil. And here is the part nobody could have predicted. The monster was, in real life, one of the gentlest, most disciplined, most thoughtful men the business ever produced. He was a strict vegetarian for 60 years. He never touched a drop of alcohol or lit a single cigarette. He practiced yoga, swallowed his vitamins every morning, read philosophy, wrote poetry, and carried a camera everywhere he went. He once remarked that no one who eats the flesh of animals can rise spiritually beyond the average. This terrifying maniac was a soft-spoken health nut who went to bed early and rose before the sun. And when his 30-year career was finally over, this gentle monster opened a school in a small Massachusetts town and quietly built the future of wrestling, training the man who would one day run the entire industry. So how did one accidental injury and one misprinted newspaper story turn a kind, vegetarian Canadian named Walter into Killer Kowalski, the most hated monster in wrestling, and the secret architect of its future? He was not born Killer, and he was not born Kowalski. He arrived in the world as Edward Władysław Spulnik on October 13th, 1926, in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, the son of Polish immigrants who had crossed an ocean in search of a better life. He grew up in a hard-working, blue-collar household just across the river from Detroit, and from the very beginning, the one thing that set him apart was simply his size. He grew and kept growing until he stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, a genuine giant for that era, with long limbs and a gaunt, angular frame that made him look less like a strong man and more like something out of a bad dream. But the body by itself was not the gift. Plenty of tall men are hopelessly clumsy. Walter was coordinated, athletic, and, above all, intelligent. He had the kind of analytical mind that in another life might have made him an engineer. And in fact, he held down a real job before wrestling ever came calling. He thought about things. He studied them. He approached his own body the way a scientist approaches an experiment. That pairing, the terrifying frame and the careful mind, is the key to everything he became, because it meant he could think his way into a character far more frightening than his height alone could ever manage. He took the ring name Kowalski, and in those earliest years he churned through a series of generic, forgettable strongman gimmicks. He was billed as Tarzan. He was billed as Hercules. He was the Polish Apollo. None of it stuck, because none of it was him. He learned the trade from one of the most genuinely dangerous men in the history of the sport, the great Tesh, a true shooter and multiple-time world champion who could wrench a man into submission for real. To study under Tesh was to study under the gold standard, the man who embodied everything legitimate and rugged about old-school wrestling, and it gave Kowalski a bedrock of real, credible toughness beneath all the theatrics. Trained by a wrestling god, gifted a monster's body and a thinker's brain, Walter Kowalski broke into the business in 1947 and went looking for the thing that would make him unforgettable. He had no idea it would find him, by sheer accident, on a Wednesday night in Montreal. For the first several years of his career, Walter Kowalski was a good big man, and nothing more than that. He toured the territories that carved up North American wrestling in that age, a reliable, imposing heavyweight who could draw a little heat and turn in a decent match. He built a signature, a flying knee drop, where he would climb the turnbuckle and launch his considerable bulk down onto a prone opponent, dropping his knee across the chest or the skull. It was dramatic, it was vivid, it made the crowd gasp, and it was about to define the rest of his life. He was big, he was capable, and he was anonymous. In a business overflowing with giants and strongmen and masked villains, there was nothing yet to set Kowalski apart from 100 other large men working the circuit. He needed an identity, a hook, the one thing that would push a promoter to print his name at the top of the card and lodge it in a fan's memory on the long drive home. Some wrestlers spend entire careers hunting for that hook and never find it. They are talented, they are dependable, and they are forgotten, drifting from territory to territory as the years stack up. Always the supporting act, never the reason anyone bought a ticket. Kowalski was traveling exactly that road, a good big man slowly running out of it, and he knew it. Kowalski's hook came hunting for him, and it showed up wearing the disguise of a catastrophe. His regular opponent in the Montreal territory was a barrel-chested, bearded brawler billed as Yukon Eric, a wildly popular strongman whose ears, after years in the ring, had swollen and hardened into the lumpy, scarred mass that wrestlers and boxers call cauliflower ear. Eric's ears were already half-ruined, brittle, packed with damaged cartilage. The two men had a strong, money-drawing rivalry, the kind of reliable feud that fills buildings night after night. Again and again, they collided, and on one of those nights, Kowalski climbed the turnbuckle to deliver the knee drop that had become his trademark. The same move, the same leap, the same descent he had carried out without a hitch, hundreds of times before. This time, fate was lying in wait on the canvas. As Kowalski came down, Yukon Eric moved, only slightly, but just enough. Instead of landing flush across Eric's body, Kowalski's shin bone glanced off the side of Eric's head, and the brittle, overworked cartilage of that cauliflowered ear simply gave way. A chunk of it tore loose and dropped to the mat in front of a packed, screaming house at the Montreal Forum. The arena exploded in horror. To the thousands of fans watching, it did not look like an accident at all. It looked like a monster had deliberately, gleefully ripped the ear off another human being. They started shrieking at him. Maniac, killer. The names came down like rain, and in that single instant, an ordinary big man became something the business had rarely seen. A genuine object of terror. What happened next sealed it forever, and it stands as one of the great ironies in the history of the sport. Kowalski, shaken and sick about what he had done, went to the hospital to check on Eric. When he stepped into the room and found his old opponent up in bed, with his head swallowed by an enormous comical bandage, Kowalski's very first thought, by his own account years afterward, was that Eric looked for all the world like Humpty Dumpty perched on a wall. He could not help himself. He began to laugh. And Yukon Eric, struck by the sheer absurdity of it, started laughing right along with him. It was a moment of shared, nervous, human relief between two colleagues. But the next morning, the newspaper got the story wrong, whether by honest mistake or by an instinct for a juicier headline. The papers reported that the heartless Kowalski had turned up at the hospital and laughed at his maimed victim, cruelly, to his face. That one misprinted detail accomplished what no promoter, no gimmick, no carefully booked storyline ever could. It transformed a freak accident into the origin myth of a monster. Overnight, Walter Kowalski was reborn as Killer Kowalski, the man who tore off an ear and laughed about it. The grudge with Yukon Eric erupted into a string of savage rematches that drew enormous crowds across the continent. The hook had found him, and now he faced a wall of his own. He was branded for life. The question was whether he could spin one accidental night into a 30-year career, or whether the world would forget him the moment the shock wore thin. Plenty of wrestlers have tripped into a single sensational moment, only to watch it evaporate within months, unable to build anything that lasts on top of it. A reputation handed to you by accident is a fragile thing. It can vanish as fast as it appeared. Kowalski now had to prove the monster was more than one terrible, lucky night. He refused to let it fade. Instead, Walter Kowalski made a cold, brilliant decision. If the world wanted a monster, he would hand them the most complete, most committed, most genuinely terrifying monster they had ever laid eyes on. This is where the thinker's mind took over. Kowalski studied his own talent for fear the way he studied everything else. He grasped that his gaunt, towering, hollow-cheeked frame was an asset, that he looked genuinely unwell, genuinely dangerous, genuinely capable of anything at all. So he leaned into it. He moved with a slow, deliberate menace. He pinned opponents with a wild, unblinking stare. He developed a finishing hold he called the claw, clamping his enormous hand around a man's midsection or skull and squeezing until the victim writhed and surrendered, a move that looked as if it could grind bone to powder. He turned the accidental savagery of the ear into a standing promise. Climb into the ring with Killer Kowalski, and you might not climb out whole. And he carried this act around the globe. Kowalski was never a regional attraction. He was a worldwide one, drawing heat and money in Canada, all across the United States, in Australia, in Japan, in Europe. Everywhere he traveled, the formula worked because fear is a universal language. And Kowalski spoke it without an accent. He became one of the most reliable box office villains on the planet, a man any promoter could import into any territory to give the local hero a monster worth conquering. He understood that he was a kind of traveling weapon, a guaranteed jolt of heat that could resurrect a sagging territory or mint a new hero overnight, simply by losing. A young babyface who could survive Killer Kowalski instantly became a star, and Kowalski knew it, and he handed that gift to opponent after opponent without ever once cracking the illusion of the monster. He even became a maker of other monsters. When a young, all but unknown giant named Andre was being introduced to North American audiences, it was Kowalski he was set against in a battle of the giants, and photographs of Andre looming over the already famous Kowalski helped cement Andre's legend in the wrestling magazines. Sit with that exchange. Kowalski was so established, so instantly recognized as the measuring stick of frightening size that simply standing beside him made an unknown giant look like a phenomenon. Kowalski did much the same favor in Japan for the great giant Baba, helping build a national hero in a televised match. The most feared man in the business was, quietly, generous enough to spend his own hard-won reputation building up the next generation. It was the first glimpse of the teacher he would one day become. The first sign that beneath the monster lived a man who cared more about the business than about his own ego. To understand Kowalski at his peak, you have to understand the hero he spent years trying to destroy, because a monster is only ever as great as the champion he threatens. That champion was Bruno Sammartino, the Italian Superman, the most beloved wrestler in the world through the 1960s and 70s, and the longest reigning champion in the history of the company that would become WWE. Bruno was a genuine folk hero to millions of working-class and immigrant fans, a powerful, honorable strongman who had survived a war as a child and forged himself into an icon. He was the people's protector, and the most dangerous, most believable threat to his throne for years on end was Killer Kowalski. This was the matchup that sold out arena after arena up and down the entire eastern seaboard. The beloved, muscular hero against the gaunt, towering monster. Bruno's fans did not merely want him to win. They needed him to, because Kowalski stood for something that truly frightened them. Picture one of those Madison Square Garden nights. The arena is a solid wall of noise. Bruno, the hero, has the monster reeling, the crowd on its feet sensing the finish, and then Kowalski's enormous hand shoots out and locks onto Bruno's midsection, the claw. the fingers boring in, and the champion's face twists in agony as he sinks slowly to one knee. The roar curdles into a scream of pure dread. 18,000 people willing their hero to escape a grip that looks like it is squeezing the life out of him. That image, the people's champion driven to his knees by the monster's hand, is what packed those buildings over and over, because the audience could never be entirely certain the hero would rise again. Twice the two men collided in the main event of Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena in the world, and twice they fought to a no decision, the monster proving so formidable that the hero simply could not put him away. Promoters could run that match again and again, in city after city, because the fear never wore off. Even at the age of 50, in 1974, Kowalski was still regarded as a credible enough threat to challenge Bruno for the championship one final time. Very few villains in history have stayed dangerous for so long, and the breadth of his peak is staggering once you lay it out. He held championships across multiple continents and promotions, a world title in one organization 5 separate times, regional and international crowns by the dozen. In 1976, masked and billed as one of the executioners alongside the enormous Big John Studd, he captured the World Tag Team Championship of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. He was so feared and so respected as an in-ring force that he was the man other wrestlers were genuinely nervous to face. A heavyweight who, by some accounts, once broke the leg of the strutting NWA World Champion Buddy Rogers in a Montreal ring, just as he had once, by accident, taken Yukon Eric's ear. There was always that whisper trailing him, that the monster might not be entirely an act, that a man who looked that dangerous and moved that deliberately might actually be capable of the things his character promised. That whisper was worth more than any belt, because it meant that every time he stepped through the ropes, a small, real part of the audience, and maybe of his opponent, wondered exactly what he might do. Picture what he was, at the very height of it, a 6'7" spectre in black, stalking toward the ring, in arena after arena, in country after country, while the crowd roared its hatred, and a beloved hero waited, afraid, in the opposite corner. For 3 decades, Walter Kowalski was the nightmare the business needed, the villain so convincing that fans forgot he was performing at all. He never wore the top world championship of the biggest companies. He never needed to. His value was not in holding the belt. His value was in being the most terrifying reason the hero had to fight for it. And the truly remarkable thing, the secret buried at the heart of all that terror, was that none of it was real. The most frightening man in wrestling was, the moment the bell rang and the lights went down, the calmest, kindest soul in the building. Slow down here, because this is the twist that makes Walter Kowalski one of the most fascinating men the sport ever produced. Everything the public believed about him was an illusion built on a single accident and a single misprint. The real Walter Kowalski was, by every account of everyone who actually knew him, a gentle, thoughtful, deeply spiritual man. He had been a strict vegetarian for 60 years, decades before it was fashionable, in an age when a giant athlete refusing to eat meat was almost unheard of. He believed, with total sincerity, that eating animals held a person back spiritually, and he lived by that conviction every day of his life. He never drank alcohol. He never smoked. He took his vitamins faithfully, practiced yoga, and lived by a simple personal motto: early to bed and early to rise. He was also an artist and an intellectual. He carried a camera everywhere and grew into a genuinely accomplished photographer, documenting the strange traveling world of professional wrestling from the inside. He wrote poetry. He read philosophy. He was, by the testimony of the men who shared locker rooms with him for 30 years, one of the most articulate, most intelligent, most genuinely kind people in the entire business. The Boston newspapers, when he died, did not call him a monster. They called him the gentle killer, and they wrote about a legacy of love. Sit with the strange weight of that life. Imagine being one of the kindest, most disciplined men in your profession and spending 30 years hated by millions of strangers as a maniac who maimed people for sport. Imagine signing up, night after night, to be the very thing parents warned their children about, knowing all the while that the real you was a vegetarian poet who went to bed early and would not hurt a soul on purpose. Kowalski carried that contradiction with a grace that tells you everything about who he actually was. He understood that the monster was a gift the public had handed him by mistake, and he honored it by playing it to perfection. And then he went home and was simply Walter. There was no bitterness in him about any of it, no sense that the world had wronged him by misreading who he really was. He seemed to grasp something most performers never do. That the character and the man are allowed to be different, that you can give an audience the nightmare they paid for, and still lay your head down at night in peace. The accident made the legend, but it never, not for a single day, changed the man. When Kowalski finally walked away from the ring in 1977, after 30 years as wrestling's most reliable nightmare, he did not drift off into the quiet retirement his gentle nature might have suggested. Instead, the monster became a teacher, and in doing so, he built a legacy far larger than any championship. In a small town in Massachusetts, Walter Kowalski opened a professional wrestling school, the Killer Kowalski Institute of Professional Wrestling, and here, the gentle, disciplined, analytical man, who had spent all those years hiding behind the monster, finally got to be himself in public. He poured his decades of knowledge, his obsession with fundamentals, his patience and his kindness into hundreds of hopeful young students. For roughly 25 years, he ran that school, and it became known across the industry as one of the great places to learn the craft, a doorway into the entire business. And the teaching reflected the real man, not the monster. By every account of those who trained under him, Kowalski was demanding but generous, a stickler for the basics who believed that character and psychology mattered every bit as much as any move, who drilled his students on the fundamentals until the fundamentals turned into instinct. He had no interest in stamping out copies of Killer Kowalski. He was interested in handing each student the tools to find their own identity, the way he had once spent years searching for his. The same analytical mind that had engineered the most convincing monster in wrestling now engineered careers. One patient lesson at a time, the students who came through that door changed wrestling forever. He trained the powerful, charismatic Joni Laura, who became Chyna, one of the most groundbreaking female stars in history. He trained Perry Saturn, and a long line of others who would go on to careers in the biggest companies in the world. But the crown jewel, the student who validated everything Kowalski had built, was a tall, driven young man named Paul Levesque, who would become Triple H, a multiple-time world champion, the husband of the boss's daughter, and eventually one of the most powerful executives in the entire industry, the man steering the creative direction of WWE itself. The single most important architect of modern wrestling learned how to wrestle in Killer Kowalski's school. Every decision shaping the business today flows, in part, from lessons a gentle giant taught in a small New England gym. And the circle closed beautifully. When Walter Kowalski was inducted into the Hall of Fame, the honor of presenting him went to his own most famous student, Triple H, the pupil inducting the master. Kowalski sold the school as his health began to fail, and on August 30th, 2008, after suffering a heart attack and spending his final days on life support, the gentle killer passed away at the age of 81, survived by his wife. He had given them the business 30 years as its greatest monster, and then given it its future. Strip away the claw, and the knee drop, and the screaming arenas. And look at what actually happened here. A thoughtful, gentle vegetarian giant From a Polish immigrant family in Windsor, Ontario, spent years as a competent, anonymous big man searching for the thing that would make him matter. He never found it. It found him in the cruelest, most random way imaginable, in the shape of an accident that tore a man's ear and a newspaper that told the story wrong. And, rather than flee from that monstrous reputation, Walter Kowalski did something that took genuine brilliance. He saw the gift hidden inside the disaster, and he played the monster better and longer, and more convincingly than anyone before him, for 30 years, all over the world, all while remaining, in private, one of the kindest men anyone in the business ever met. Then, he did the thing that truly sets him apart. He took everything the monster had taught him, all that discipline and intelligence and patience, and he gave it away. He spent his final decades not chasing one more match or one more payday, but teaching, building, lifting up the next generation, including the very man who would grow up to run the whole industry. The accident made him a legend, but the teaching made him immortal, in a way no single match ever could. There are wrestlers all over the world today, and in the highest offices of the business, who can trace their craft straight back to a gentle giant in a small Massachusetts gym. That is the real Killer Kowalski. Not a maniac who maimed a man for fun. A kind, brilliant soul who was handed a monster by accident, wore it like a master, and then quietly built the future once the show was over. So where does he actually rank? And you have to be honest, because the case for Kowalski is unusual, and it does not run through championships. If the question is who was the greatest champion, Kowalski is not the answer, and it is not close. He never held the top world title of the major companies. He was the great challenger, the unforgettable threat, the monster the hero had to overcome, but the belt itself almost always slipped through his fingers. His own trainer, Lou Thesz, was a far more legitimate and decorated wrestler. Bruno Sammartino, the man he chased for years, wore the crown that Kowalski never did. And his single most famous moment, the thing his whole legend rests on, was not a masterpiece of skill or strategy. It was an accident, magnified by a printing error. By the cold arithmetic of titles won, plenty of men rank above him. But change the question, and Kowalski's case turns extraordinary. Ask who was one of the greatest, most enduring, most genuinely frightening villains the business ever produced. And he sits on the shortest of short lists, a monster who stayed credible and bankable for an almost unheard of 30 years, across multiple continents. Ask who helped build the legends of others, and you find him lending his own reputation to Andre the Giant and Giant Barber. And then ask the question that truly sets him apart from everyone. Who, after their career was over, personally trained the people who would carry the entire industry forward? Almost no great wrestler can answer that. Kowalski can. The man who runs the creative heart of modern WWE learned his craft in Kowalski's ring. That is a kind of greatness that has nothing to do with belts. So how good was he actually? As a champion, he was not one, and that is a real limit. But as a villain, as a draw, as a craftsman of fear, he ranks among the very best who ever lived, and as a teacher, as a builder of others, he may stand nearly alone. The honest verdict fits a gentle man who was handed a monster by accident. Killer Kowalski never wore the biggest crown, and his legend began with a freak injury and a lie. But he turned that accident into 30 years of greatness, and then turned his retirement into the foundation of wrestling's future. The accident made the monster. The man made the legends. A gentle vegetarian who wrote poetry and turned in early spent 30 years as the most feared monster on earth because of one accidental knee drop and one wrong headline, and then spent his retirement quietly building the men who would inherit the whole business. But the man who trained that monster, the shooter who taught Walter Kowalski how to wrestle, was something else entirely. A 6-time world champion and a legitimately dangerous fighter who stood for everything real and rugged about the old school. the man other wrestlers were truly afraid to anger. Next time, we tell the story of Lou Thesz, the last true wrestling god, the man who could have hurt anyone he pleased and almost never did, and the standard of legitimacy that nearly every champion of his century was quietly measured against.